Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Paranoid Stories. Before we start, make sure to leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. I'm really interested in that. Now, let's begin. I'm a barista, 25, and I do photography on the side. Nothing professional, just nature stuff I post sometimes. I'm pretty rational about things. I don't do ghost tours or read creepypasta. So when I rented this cabin near Lake Quinault for a long weekend to shoot the old-growth forest, I was thinking about light conditions and composition, not whatever the hell ended up happening. The cabin was cheap, $40 a night, listed as rustic, which meant no Wi-Fi and a wood stove that barely worked. One room, a narrow kitchen area, a bathroom that smelled like mildew. The kind of place you rent when you're trying to save money and don't mind being uncomfortable. I got there Friday afternoon, unloaded my gear, locked the door behind me. The key was one of those old brass ones, heavy, with a leather tag that said Quinault No. 7 in faded marker. I remember putting it in my jacket pocket specifically because the table by the door was wobbly and I didn't trust it. Saturday morning I woke up and made coffee on the camp stove. When I turned around, the key was lying on the floor about 3 feet inside the door, just sitting there on the warped floorboards. I picked it up, checked my jacket. Empty pocket. I figured maybe it fell out when I hung the jacket up the night before, slid across the floor or something. Didn't make perfect sense, but I wasn't going to obsess over a dropped key. I spent the day hiking the Quinault Loop Trail, shooting moss-covered maples and the way the fog moved through the canopy. Got back around 5, cooked some ramen, reviewed my shots on the camera's tiny screen. They looked good. I was alone out there, hadn't seen another person all day, and the isolation felt productive, peaceful even. Locked the door. Put the key in my jeans pocket this time. Went to bed. Sunday morning, the key was on the floor again. Same spot, 3 feet inside the door. I stood there holding my coffee, staring at it. My jeans were on the chair where I'd left them. I checked the pocket. Empty. The door was locked from the inside. I had to turn the deadbolt to get out. I walked around the cabin looking for an explanation. The windows didn't open more than a crack. There was no other entrance. The floor wasn't slanted enough to make something slide that far. Look, I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, but my hands felt cold holding that key. I put it on the table, weighed it down with my camera bag, and told myself I was being stupid. I went out again that afternoon. Different trail, deeper into the forest. I was shooting a massive Sitka spruce when I thought I saw someone standing in the periphery of my frame. Just for a second. A tall, dark shape between the trees about 50 yards back. I lowered the camera and looked. Nothing there. Shadows playing tricks. The forest was dense, and the light was weird, flat and directionless. I took the shot anyway and moved on. That night I went through the day's photos on my laptop. The image with the spruce stopped me cold. There was something in the background, a shadow but wrong, too tall, too distinct. It didn't match the tree line. The shape was vaguely human, elongated, like someone standing but stretched vertically. And it was dark in a way that seemed to absorb the light around it. I zoomed in. The resolution got grainy, but the shape didn't resolve into branches or a trick of contrast. It just stayed there, indistinct but undeniably present. I checked the next photo in the sequence, taken maybe 10 seconds later from a slightly different angle. The shape had moved. Not much, maybe 5 feet to the left, closer to where I'd been standing. My breath went shallow. I clicked through more images. 4 more shots from that location, spread over about 3 minutes. In each one, the shape had shifted position. Always closer, always in the deep background but advancing in increments too subtle to notice in real time. By the last photo, it was maybe 30 yards away. I hadn't seen it, not once. I'd been alone. I checked photos from earlier in the day. There, in a shot of a rotting nurse log. The same shadow, distant, barely visible in the tree line. I hadn't noticed it then either. I scrolled further back to Saturday's images. It was there too, in 12 different shots across 2 days. Always in the background, always watching, always slightly closer than the photo before. The cabin felt smaller suddenly. I turned off the laptop and sat in the dark because the lamplight made the windows into black mirrors, and I couldn't stand seeing my reflection next to that empty glass. I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside. Not a footstep exactly, but a weight shifting on the gravel near the porch. A slow, dragging sound that stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. The door handle didn't move. The sound didn't repeat. After maybe 10 minutes of silence, I got up and checked. The door was still locked. The key was in my pocket. I didn't open it. When the sun came up Monday, I packed everything in about 15 minutes. I wasn't thinking clearly, I just wanted out. I grabbed my camera off the table, and that's when I saw it. The display screen was still on from the night before, showing the last photo I'd reviewed, the one with the shape 30 yards away. Except now, in the screen's frozen image, the shape was at the edge of the frame, maybe 10 yards from where I'd been standing when I took the shot. I don't know how to explain that. The image file didn't change. I checked it again later on my laptop, and it showed the shape at 30 yards, exactly where it had been. But on the camera's screen, in that moment, it was closer. Like something had moved in the static image itself, or like the camera had captured something my laptop couldn't render. I left. I didn't lock the door. I got in my car and drove 4 hours straight back to Seattle. Here's the thing that I can't let go of. I keep thinking about the key, how it kept appearing inside the locked cabin, and how, in all those photos, the shape never got close enough to be in focus. Like it understood the camera's limitations. Like it knew exactly how to stay in the margin where details blur. I still have the photos. I've looked at them maybe 100 times. The shape is there, always in the background, but here's what makes my hands shake. When I zoom in, really zoom in until the pixels break apart, sometimes the shape has these pale spots where a face would be, 2 small patches of lighter darkness. I think they might be eyes. I haven't been back to that cabin. I did call the rental office to ask if anyone else had reported anything strange. The woman on the phone got quiet for a second, then said the cabin had been unoccupied for 3 months before my stay. No one had rented it. When I told her I definitely stayed there, definitely paid, she just said she'd look into it and hung up. My camera's shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. Fast enough to freeze a bird in flight, but if something moved slowly enough, patient enough, it would only register between frames. And I keep thinking about that last morning, how the key was inside the locked door again. How something that moves too slowly to see could still cover distance, given enough time. How it might still be moving now, crossing whatever gap remains between where I was and where I am. I don't go hiking anymore. I haven't taken a photograph in 6 weeks. And sometimes late at night I pull up those images just to make sure the shape hasn't gotten any closer. It hasn't. But every time I check, I notice the background is a little darker than I remember, like the space around the shape is collapsing inward. And I know how that sounds, but I can see it happening. Frame by frame, the forest in those photos is being swallowed by that spreading darkness, and I have no way to prove any of this to anyone who wasn't there. My name's Henry Dixon. Most people call me Hank, and I do residential renovation work. Mostly old houses that need serious structural fixes before they're livable again. I'm not the type who believes in paranormal stuff. I watch those ghost hunting shows when I'm eating lunch sometimes, but it's entertainment, you know? Background noise. The house was a foreclosure near Tacoma. Built in 1907, hadn't been touched in maybe 20 years. The bank hired me to assess the foundation and get the place sellable. Standard job. The exterior wasn't bad. Some rot around the window frames, missing shingles, but the cellar needed work. That's where most of the structural issues hide in these old places. The cellar entrance was outside, those slanted wooden doors that opened to concrete steps going down. The smell hit me first when I opened it. Not rot or mildew like I expected, just cold, still air. The kind that's been trapped underground so long it doesn't feel like it belongs to the same atmosphere as everything above it. I had to duck under the floor joists. The ceiling was maybe 6 feet high, exposed beams thick with cobwebs. My work light caught the edges of old masonry, a dirt floor in most places, concrete poured in patches where previous owners had tried to reinforce things. And in the back corner, almost hidden behind a support column, there was a cistern. I'd seen these before. Pre-plumbing water storage, usually fed by gutters and downspouts. This one was built into the floor, maybe 4 feet across, ringed with mortared stone. I figured it'd be dry or filled with debris. It wasn't. The water was black, not dark, black. My light didn't penetrate it at all, just sat on the surface like oil. I knelt down next to it, careful on the uneven floor, and aimed my flashlight straight down. The reflection of the ceiling beams appeared in the water, clear as a mirror, every joist, every nail head, the tangle of old wiring stapled to the wood. But here's what I noticed right away, and I don't know why it bothered me so much. The reflection didn't match. I looked up at the actual ceiling, then back down at the water. The beams were in different positions, not wildly different, just offset, like the reflection was showing the ceiling from 5 degrees to the left, maybe. I moved my head, thinking it was an angle thing, a trick of perspective. The reflection didn't adjust with me. I stood up, told myself it was mineral content in the water distorting things, or the age of the stone creating a weird lens effect. I had work to do. I marked the cistern on my assessment notes. Needs sealing, potential contamination, and moved on to checking the foundation walls. But I kept glancing back at it. An hour later, I was on the opposite side of the cellar inspecting cracks in the mortar when I heard water drip. Single drops hitting a surface. I turned around. The cistern was too far away for me to have heard that, and there was no moisture on the ceiling above me. I aimed my light up, bone dry. The dripping continued, slow, steady, every 4 or 5 seconds. I walked back to the cistern, stood over it. The sound was louder here, but I couldn't see where it was coming from. The ceiling above the cistern was dry too. I crouched down again, shining my light across the water's surface, looking for ripples, disturbances, anything. The reflected ceiling was different now. Not just offset, different. There was a crack running through one of the beams in the reflection. A deep split, like the wood had been struck with something heavy. I looked up, no crack. The actual beam was intact. My hands started sweating inside my work gloves. I backed away from the cistern and finished my assessment as fast as I could. Took photos of the foundation issues, measured the support columns, checked the sill plates for rot. I didn't go near the water again, but the dripping followed me. Everywhere I moved in that cellar, I heard it. Same interval, same volume, like it was in my head. When I got back upstairs and closed the cellar doors, the sound stopped immediately. I didn't go back down there for 2 days. I had other projects to finish, and I told myself I'd deal with the cellar work later. But the bank was pushing for a timeline, and I'd already accepted the deposit. On the 3rd day, I brought a pump. The plan was simple: drain the cistern, seal it with concrete, move on. The pump was a commercial sump, powerful enough to clear the cistern in maybe 20 minutes. I set it up on the edge, lowered the intake hose into the black water, and hit the switch. Nothing happened. The motor was running. I could hear it, feel the vibration, but no water came out of the discharge hose. I pulled the intake hose out. Dry, completely dry. I lowered it back in, tried again. Same result. I shut the pump off, stared at the water. It hadn't moved, hadn't rippled when I dropped the hose in, hadn't reacted to anything. That's when I saw the shape. It was in the reflection, not on the surface, in the reflection, down where the ceiling beams were. At first I thought it was a support column I'd missed, something my brain was filling in wrong. But it moved, slowly, a shift in position, from one side of the reflected cellar to the other. I looked up at the actual ceiling. Nothing there, just empty space and beams. I looked back down at the water. The shape was closer now, taller than the beams, thin, standing upright, and it was directly behind where I was crouched. I didn't turn around. I don't know why. Some part of my brain understood that if I turned around and saw nothing, that would be worse. Instead, I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the water. The shape in the reflection didn't move, just stood there, too tall, too still. I grabbed my equipment and left. Here's the thing, I'm not the type to abandon a job. I've worked in crawl spaces full of black mold, in attics where the insulation was half rat nests, in basements that flooded every spring. I've never walked away from a project before. I called the bank that afternoon and told them I couldn't finish the assessment. Told them there were structural issues beyond my scope, that they'd need a specialized foundation contractor. They weren't happy, but they paid me for the work I'd done and found someone else. I should have left it there. But 2 weeks later, I started hearing the dripping again. Not in the house near Tacoma, in my own apartment. It started at night. I'd be lying in bed almost asleep, and I'd hear it. Slow, steady, same interval. I'd turn on the lights, check the bathroom, the kitchen sink, the ceiling. Nothing. No moisture anywhere. It's been 3 months now. The dripping hasn't stopped. It's not constant. Sometimes I'll go a whole day without hearing it. But it always comes back. Usually when I'm alone. Usually when it's quiet. Last week I was working on a different project, a bathroom remodel in Olympia. 2nd floor, no basement, nothing unusual about the house. I was pulling up old tile when I saw it in the toilet water, just for a second before I blinked. The reflection of the bathroom ceiling, but wrong, offset. And in the corner of the reflection, barely visible, that shape. Tall, thin, standing behind me. I don't look at still water anymore. Not puddles, not sinks filled for dishes, not anything. And I don't take jobs with basements. I'm a locksmith, have been for 17 years. I've changed locks on foreclosures, evictions, crime scenes, you name it. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. But I need to talk about a job I did last month outside Bellingham because I still don't understand what happened, and it's eating at me. The property management company called me on a Tuesday. Standard foreclosure job, isolated house about 20 minutes past the main highway, needed all exterior locks changed before they could list it. They warned me the previous owner had let the place go to hell, but the pay was good and I had the afternoon free. I loaded up my van and drove out. The house sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by dense Douglas fir. Not unusual for that area, but the trees felt closer than they should have, like they'd crept toward the structure over time. The place was a single-story ranch, probably built in the 70s with peeling blue paint and a yard that had gone completely wild. I grabbed my toolbox and walked up to the front door. That's when I noticed the first weird thing. The deadbolt was engaged. I could see it through the gap in the door frame, but when I knelt down to pick the lock, the keyhole was packed solid, not just blocked, filled. I pulled out my penlight and aimed it into the opening, and I could see dark brown soil compressed into the cylinder, packed in so tight it looked almost ceramic. I tried to hook some out with my pick, but it was rock hard, dried completely through. I walked around to the side door, same thing, back door, kitchen door. Every single lock on that house had been deliberately filled with dirt and left to dry. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure those locks couldn't be opened with keys, but they'd still engage the deadbolts from inside somehow before sealing them. I stood there for a minute trying to make sense of it. My first thought was maybe the previous owner had some kind of breakdown, got paranoid about people breaking in. Foreclosures bring out strange behavior in people, but this was methodical, purposeful. I called the property manager. She sounded annoyed when I explained the situation, told me to drill out the cylinders and bill for the extra time. So that's what I did. The front door took me about 15 minutes to drill through. The soil inside the lock had hardened into something like concrete. My bit kept catching and overheating. When I finally got the cylinder out, a thin stream of dirt trickled onto the porch, and I caught a smell. Fresh earth. The kind of smell you get after rain when you're walking through the woods. It didn't make sense. This dirt had been bone dry seconds ago. I pushed the door open. The inside of the house was dim. All the curtains were drawn, and the air had that stale quality of a place that's been closed up too long. But underneath that was something else, something organic and damp. I stepped into the entryway and immediately felt the temperature difference. It was at least 10 degrees colder inside than out, and the air sat heavy in my lungs. The living room was mostly empty, except for a couch and a coffee table covered in old mail. The walls were bare, no pictures, no decorations. I moved through to the kitchen and found more of the same, stripped down, impersonal. The only thing that stood out was the back door. Same blue paint as the exterior, but someone had scratched deep grooves into the wood around the lock, like they'd clawed at it. The marks were too irregular to have been made with a tool. I needed to change 5 locks total, front, back, side, kitchen, and a door leading down to the basement. I decided to work my way through the main floor first and leave the basement for last. The side door went faster than the front. I'd figured out the right drill speed and pressure to get through the packed soil. As I worked, I became aware of how quiet it was. No birds outside, no wind, just the whine of my drill and my own breathing. When I pulled the cylinder, the same thin stream of dirt, the same smell of fresh earth. I installed the new lock and tested it. Smooth action, clean install. I stepped back, and that's when I noticed the smell hadn't faded. It was still there, wafting up from under the door. I bent down and put my hand near the gap at the bottom of the door. Cool air was seeping in, and it carried that scent of turned soil so strongly I could almost taste it. I went back to the front door, same thing. The smell of earth was coming from outside, filtering in through the gap. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Normal forest smell, pine and old leaves and that faint rot of undergrowth. But when I knelt down and sniffed near the gap under the door, I got that rich, freshly dug earth smell again. It was only coming from inside the house. Look, I'm a rational person. I tried to logic it out. Maybe there was a crawl space issue. Maybe animals had been digging under the foundation. But I'd been under hundreds of houses, and I knew what animal activity smelled like. This wasn't that. I moved faster after that. The kitchen door gave me trouble. The drill bit snapped halfway through, and I had to get a replacement from the van. By the time I got the new lock installed, my hands were shaking. Not from the work, from the cold. The temperature inside had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath. That left the basement door. It was set into the hallway between the kitchen and what looked like a bedroom. Same cheap hollow core construction as the others, but the lock was different. Someone had installed a deadbolt that was much newer than the rest of the hardware in the house. Industrial grade, the kind of lock you'd put on an exterior door. The keyhole was packed with the same dirt, but when I touched the door handle, I pulled my hand back immediately. The metal was ice cold, cold enough that it actually hurt to touch. I don't know why this detail matters, but it stuck with me. There was a draft coming from under that door. A steady, cool flow of air, but basements don't have drafts like that. They're usually warmer than the rest of the house, or at least still. This felt like standing in front of an open refrigerator. I started drilling. The bit fought me worse than any of the others. The soil was packed so tightly, I had to stop twice to let the drill motor cool. My hands were numb from the cold, and sweat was running down my back despite the temperature. The smell of earth got stronger as I worked, thick enough now that I was breathing it in with every inhale. When the cylinder finally gave way, more dirt fell out than from the other locks. A small pile of it, maybe half a cup, spilled onto the hallway floor. I bent down to sweep it aside and froze. The soil was damp. Not just damp, wet, dark and heavy with moisture. I touched it and my fingers came away muddy. I installed that last lock faster than I've ever installed anything in my life. My hands were shaking so badly I stripped one of the screws and had to back it out and start over. The whole time that smell kept getting stronger, and the cold draft from under the door intensified. When I finally tightened the last screw and tested the lock, I heard something. A sound from behind the basement door, soft, like something shifting, settling. I packed up my tools and headed for the front door. That's when I looked back down the hallway and saw the new lock I'd just installed on the basement door. There was something in the keyhole, something dark. I walked back. I didn't want to, but I had to know. A thin trickle of fresh soil was pushing through the keyhole from the other side. As I watched, it began to pile up on the floor, growing slowly into a small mound. The dirt was wet and black, and it smelled like a forest floor after weeks of rain. I left the house. I got in my van and I drove back to town, and I called the property manager and told her the job was done. She asked if everything went okay, and I said yes, because what else was I going to say? I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me last spring, and I need you to understand. I'm not someone who gets rattled easily. I've been logging since I was 19, worked solo in some pretty remote places, and I've always been fine with the isolation, comfortable with it even. The job was straightforward on paper. Private landowner bought a parcel near Rainier, wanted selective logging done before winter, and my bid came in lowest. The access was shit. Had to hike in about 2 miles with my gear because the old logging road had washed out years ago, but the pay was good, and I'm used to working alone. The first 3 days were normal. Cold mornings, decent timber, no problems. I'd start around 7, work until 3 or 4, hike back to my truck. The forest was quiet in that heavy way old growth gets, where sound doesn't carry right. On the 4th day, I started noticing the movement. It was always when I was running the saw. Just these quick flickers at the edge of my vision, something low to the ground, moving fast. At first I thought it was animals, deer maybe, or coyotes spooked by the chainsaw noise. But every time I'd kill the engine and look, there'd be nothing. Just trees and undergrowth and that thick silence. Here's the thing. The movements were too coordinated, too deliberate. They'd happen on my left, then my right, then behind me, like something was circling. And they were always the same height, maybe 2 feet off the ground, moving in these short, rapid bursts. I know what you're thinking. Peripheral vision plays tricks, especially when you're tired and staring at work for hours. I told myself the same thing. But on day 5, something changed. I was bucking up a big Douglas fir, maybe 3 feet across, when I saw the movement again, closer this time, maybe 20 yards out. I shut down the saw immediately, and in that sudden quiet I heard it. Scraping. Not like branches dragging, not like an animal moving through brush. It was the sound of something being pulled across wet ground, slow, deliberate, coming from multiple directions at once. I stood there with the silent chainsaw in my hands, and I could hear it moving around me in a wide circle. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, always from a slightly different position. My hands were shaking when I started the saw back up. The noise felt like protection somehow. As long as the engine was running, I couldn't hear what was out there. I finished that tree and started hiking out early. Told myself I'd come back in the morning with fresh perspective, maybe bring a radio or something to break up the quiet. But I knew I was lying to myself. I knew something was wrong. That night I barely slept. Kept thinking about the pattern of those movements, the way they seemed to anticipate where I'd be working. The next morning I almost didn't go back. Almost called the landowner and made up some excuse about equipment failure, but I needed the money, and in daylight, with coffee in me, it seemed manageable. I got to the site around 8. Everything looked normal. My equipment was where I'd left it, the felled trees undisturbed. I got to work on a big cedar, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, clearing. The saw was loud enough that I couldn't hear anything else, which should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because I could still see them. The movements were constant now, happening every few minutes. Quick dashes from one patch of undergrowth to another, always just outside clear sight. And they were getting closer. What had been 20 yards away was now maybe 10, maybe less. I shut down the saw to check my fuel mix, and that's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Breathing. Not one source. Multiple. Rapid, shallow breathing coming from the bushes around me, like several people had just finished sprinting. And underneath that, the scraping sound again, but faster now, more urgent. I'd like to say I calmly packed up my gear and walked out. That's not what happened. I grabbed my saw and my wedges and I fucking ran. Didn't even try to bring the fuel cans or my spare chains. Just ran back toward the old logging road, branches whipping my face, my boots catching on roots. The scraping followed me. I could hear it keeping pace in the woods on both sides of the trail, sometimes ahead of me, always just out of sight. And the worst part, the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it, was that it stayed exactly at the edge of my vision. No matter how fast I moved or which direction I looked, the movement was always in that peripheral space where you can't quite focus. I made it back to my truck, threw my gear in the bed, and drove 3 hours home without stopping. Called the landowner that night and told him I was done. Equipment failure. Couldn't finish the job. He was pissed, but I didn't care. Told him he could keep my deposit, keep everything. I just wanted to be done with that place. That was 6 months ago. I haven't logged since. Been doing construction work in town, which pays less but keeps me around people, around witnesses. But here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. When I ran, when I was crashing through that forest with those sounds following me, I passed by some of the trees I'd already felled, and on one of them, in the fresh sawdust near the stump, there were marks. Dozens of them. Small handprints maybe, or something like handprints, pressed into the sawdust in a circle around where I'd been working. I didn't stop to look closer, didn't take pictures. I just kept running. Sometimes now, when I'm working a construction site or walking to my truck after dark, I'll catch movement in my peripheral vision, just for a second, just at that same low height, moving fast, and I'll freeze, waiting to hear if it's followed by that scraping sound. So far it hasn't been, but I've stopped working alone and I don't go into the woods anymore, not for any reason, because I keep thinking about those handprints in the sawdust and how many there were and how they were arranged, not scattered randomly, but deliberately, like they'd been standing there watching me work for a long time before I ever noticed them. I'm not the type who looks for weird stuff. I just check water samples and file reports. But what I found last March in the Skagit tributary changed how I think about that stretch of river. The Department of Ecology sent me out after 3 days of heavy rain, unusual for late winter. Standard protocol: test turbidity, check for runoff contamination, document any debris accumulation. I'd been to this spot maybe a dozen times before. It's about 2 miles past where the logging road ends, accessible only by a narrow hiking trail that most people don't know exists. The river bends sharp there, creating a deep pool that stays calm even when the current's running fast everywhere else. I parked at the trailhead around 9 in the morning. The rain had stopped the night before, but everything was still dripping. The trail was muddy as hell, and I had to move slow to keep my equipment dry. When I reached the pool, I set up on the flat rocks where I always work. Good vantage point, easy access to the water. That's when I noticed something odd about the way the light was hitting the surface. There were these shapes underneath, distributed across the pool bed in what looked almost like a pattern. I figured maybe debris from upstream, branches, trash, whatever the storm had kicked loose, but the shapes were too uniform, too deliberately spaced. I waded in with my boots and a telescoping pole we use for sediment samples. The water was cold enough to make my legs ache immediately. I hooked the first object and pulled it up. It was a photograph, laminated, the old-school, thick kind you don't see anymore, with what looked like fishing weights glued to the back. The photo itself showed a family, mom, dad, 3 kids, sitting on a checkered blanket, picnic set up. The location was immediately recognizable, the exact flat rocks where I'd just been standing. Same distinctive boulder formation in the background, same angle of the tree line. But every face in the photo had been carefully scratched away, not violently gouged out, methodically removed. The scratches were precise, surgical almost, stopping exactly at the hairline and jawline of each person. 5 perfect blank ovals where faces should have been. The photo was dated on the back in faded pencil, July 1947. I stood there in the water, holding this thing, trying to make sense of it. Then I looked down at the shapes I'd seen from the rocks. There had to be hundreds of them down there, scattered across the pool bed like someone had spent hours carefully placing them. I started pulling them up, one after another, each one laminated, each one weighted, each one showing people at this exact location, fishing, swimming, having cookouts, posing next to old cars parked where the trail ends now. The dates ranged from the mid-1940s to the late 1950s. Different families, different seasons, different activities. But always this spot. Always the same meticulous destruction of every face. Not just scratched out, I realized as I went through them. Some faces were covered by what looked like deliberate thumbprints pressed into the emulsion before it dried. Others had been chemically treated. The image dissolved precisely over the eyes and nose, leaving the rest intact. Whoever did this had used multiple methods, but always with the same careful attention to completely obscuring every face while leaving everything else untouched. I don't know how else to explain it, but the precision was what got to me. This wasn't vandalism. This was systematic. After pulling up maybe 30 or 40 photos, I noticed something that made me stop. In one image, a group of teenagers jumping off the rocks into the water, there was a shadow in the background, just visible at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by trees. It looked like someone standing back from the group, watching. The shadow was too far away to show detail, but you could make out the general shape. Human. Still. I went back through the photos I'd already collected, looking more carefully at the backgrounds. That shadow appeared in 7 of them, always at the edge, always partially hidden, always in a position that suggested the person was deliberately staying out of the main composition while still being present. And in every photo where that shadow appeared, the faces weren't just obscured, they were completely obliterated, scratched so deep the lamination was torn through. The water felt colder suddenly. I was standing thigh-deep in a pool containing hundreds of photographs that someone had spent God knows how long preparing and placing. The weights weren't random, they were calibrated. These photos were meant to sink, but not be carried away by the current. They were meant to stay here. I should have called it in right then. That would have been the smart thing. But I kept pulling them up, working my way toward the center of the pool where the concentration seemed heaviest. My hands were numb from the cold water, but I couldn't stop. Then I found one that was different. Same lamination, same weighted backing, same era, but this photo hadn't been placed underwater. It was pinned under a rock at the edge of the pool, positioned so it would be visible from the flat rocks where I'd set up my equipment, like it had been left there recently for someone to find. The photo showed the pool from an elevated angle, looking down at the water, at the flat rocks, at a figure standing exactly where I'd been standing that morning, wearing the same color jacket I had on. The image quality was poor, overexposed, and slightly out of focus, but the location was unmistakable. The figure's face was already scratched out. The photo was dated on the back, March 2024. I got out of the water. I didn't collect my equipment. I didn't finish the survey. I just left it all there and walked back to my truck as fast as the mud would let me. I told my supervisor there'd been unexpected erosion and I'd need to return with different gear. I haven't been back to file the real report. Last week, the department sent another monitor to that site. Standard rotation. She came back saying everything looked normal, asked why I'd flagged the location for a follow-up, said there was no debris in the pool at all. Water was clear. I still have the photo from under the rock. I keep it in my truck's glove box because I can't bring myself to throw it away, but I can't keep it in my house either. Sometimes when I'm driving, I feel it there, and I have to pull over because my hands start shaking too badly to hold the wheel. The thing is, I never told anyone what I found, not the specifics, but that doesn't explain how I got a package last week. No return address. Inside was a single laminated photograph, weighted, ready for placement. It showed my truck, parked at the trailhead taken from somewhere up on the hillside above. The date on the back was last month, a day I wasn't anywhere near that river. My face was already gone, just a clean oval of scratches where it should have been. I'm a high school history teacher. Tommy Jordan, 40 years old, steady job, same routine for the past 6 years. I teach at Forks High School and drive south on Highway 101 every other weekend to check on my parents in Aberdeen. Dad's got early dementia, Mom's handling it alone, and I'm the only kid who stuck around the Pacific Northwest. It's a 2-hour drive through empty coastal road, thick trees on both sides, fog rolling in off the ocean most nights. I've made that drive so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. About 4 months ago, I started noticing something on one of my Friday night drives down, mile marker 178, just past that long curve where the road sweeps close to the cliffs. There was a piece of clothing caught on the post, a work jacket, pale blue, completely waterlogged like it had been pulled from the ocean. It hung there limp, one sleeve twisted around the marker. I remember thinking someone must have lost it, maybe thrown it from a car window. Weird spot for it, but the coast gets strange litter sometimes. 2 weeks later, same drive, I saw it again, but not at 178. It was at mile marker 171, 7 miles further south. Same jacket. I'm sure of it because of this rust-colored stain on the collar shaped like a handprint. That detail stuck with me even though I was only going 65 when I passed it. The jacket was tied to that post deliberately, knotted tight around the reflective strip. I didn't think much of it that second time. Told myself maybe I'd been mistaken about where I saw it before, that I'd mixed up the mile markers in my head. The drive's monotonous enough that details blur together. But then it happened again. And again. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, that jacket moved south. Mile 164, mile 157, mile 149. Always on a Friday night when I was driving down to see my parents. Always tied to the post at a curve, never on a straight stretch of road. I started slowing down when I'd approached the next likely spot, trying to catch it in my headlights. My hands would get clammy on the steering wheel. There's something about seeing the same object in different places, moving in the same direction you're moving, that makes your brain itch. It feels targeted even when you can't explain why. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I stop and grab it, throw it away, prove to myself it was just some random piece of trash? Here's why. Highway 101 at night is pitch black between towns, and those curves have no shoulder. You don't just pull over on a cliffside road in the fog because you're curious about a jacket. And honestly, part of me didn't want to touch it. The way it hung there, dripping even when it hadn't rained, something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate to anyone, especially not to myself. By the 6th sighting, mile marker 134 just south of Queets, I started taking notes. I'm a history teacher. Documentation felt like the rational thing to do. I logged the date, the mile marker, the approximate time I passed it. I even took a photo on my phone, though it came out blurry, just a pale smudge against the dark post. When I showed it to my colleague Derek on Monday, he squinted at the screen and said, "Looks like a garbage bag, man. You okay?" I didn't bring it up again. The pattern held for 3 months. The jacket moved roughly 7 miles south every 2 weeks, always appearing on the nights I drove to Aberdeen. On the weekends I stayed in Forks, I wouldn't see it. On the rare Friday I left early and took Highway 12 instead to avoid traffic. It wouldn't appear on 101. It was tracking my route, my schedule. I started driving during the day, Saturdays instead of Fridays, leaving at noon with full sun overhead. I didn't see the jacket once in daylight, but my parents needed me on weekends, and my teaching schedule meant I couldn't always control when I left. So eventually I had to go back to those Friday night drives. 3 weeks ago, mile marker 119, the jacket was there again, but this time when I passed it, my headlights caught something else. A figure standing about 30 feet past the marker, just off the shoulder. tall, thin, wearing what looked like fishing waders. They weren't facing the road. They were facing the ocean, completely still, like they were waiting for something. I only saw them for a second before the curve took them out of view, but my breath caught in my throat so hard I nearly veered into the other lane. I called my mom that night from a gas station in Hoquiam, told her I'd be late, that I needed to clear my head. She asked if I was all right. I said yes. I don't think she believed me. Last Friday, I left Forks just after sundown. I told myself I'd drive straight through, no looking, no slowing down at the curves. But when I got to mile marker 112, my headlights caught that pale blue again. The jacket was there, knotted tight, sleeves spread wide like it was waving. And this time there were two figures on the shoulder, both in waders, both facing away. I hit the gas. My Civic's engine screamed as I pushed it past 80 on a road meant for 50. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't breathe right until I saw the lights of Aberdeen ahead. I stayed with my parents through Sunday. Didn't leave the house except to buy groceries. Dad didn't recognize me the first morning, thought I was his brother who died in 1997. Mom just kept apologizing, wringing her hands. I told her it was fine. It wasn't fine. Nothing felt fine. Sunday night, I got back to my car in their driveway around 8. I needed to get home, prep my lesson plans for Monday, try to sleep in my own bed. I walked up to the driver's side door, keys in hand, and that's when I saw it. The jacket was tied to my door handle. Not snagged, not draped, tied. The sleeves were knotted around the handle in a tight, deliberate bow, the kind you'd use to secure a boat to a dock. It was soaking wet, dripping onto the pavement in a dark puddle that didn't reflect the streetlight overhead. The rust-colored stain on the collar was still there, but now I could see it clearly. It wasn't rust. It was the shape of fingers, 4 long marks like someone had grabbed it with a filthy, stained hand. I didn't touch it. I called my mom, told her I needed to stay another night, that I wasn't feeling well. She didn't ask questions. I slept on their couch with every light in the house on. Monday morning, the jacket was gone. No puddle, no wet marks, nothing. I drove back to Forks on Highway 12, took the long way, added an extra 40 minutes to my commute. I haven't driven 101 at night since. I'm not the type who believes in ghost stories or paranormal stuff. I fix tractors, feed cattle, and go home. That's it. But what happened in March of last year still keeps me up some nights, and I need to tell someone about it. I was working late on the Henderson property, about 40 miles outside Colfax, in the Palouse Hills. The family was in Spokane for the week, and I was covering the evening feeding rotation. It had been raining all day, that cold, penetrating drizzle we get in early spring that soaks straight through your jacket. The barn was warm, at least, filled with the low sounds of cattle shifting in their stalls and the steady drum of rain on the metal roof. I was halfway through filling the feed troughs when I heard it, a scratching sound coming from above, slow, rhythmic, like someone dragging a nail across wood. I stopped and listened. The sound continued, consistent, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I looked up at the rafters, thinking maybe a branch had come loose and was scraping against the roof. But the sound was too regular, too precise, and it was coming from directly above the center of the barn, the weather vane. I'd walked past that barn 100 times and never paid attention to the rusted rooster-shaped vane on the peak of the roof. But now I could hear it clearly, that dry, grinding scratch of metal on shingles. What made it strange was that it wasn't squeaking. Weather vanes squeak when they turn. This was different. This was the sound of something being carved. I stepped outside into the rain. The wind had died completely. The trees stood motionless. The tall grass in the field beside the barn wasn't moving at all. But up on the roof, the weather vane was spinning, fast. Faster than wind could ever push it. I stood there getting soaked, watching this thing rotate in tight, rapid circles while the rain fell straight down around me. My first thought was mechanical. Maybe the bearing had failed and gravity was somehow pulling it around, but that didn't explain the speed or the sound. I went back inside and grabbed a ladder from the equipment shed. I don't know why I decided to climb up there. Maybe I thought I could just stop it, fix whatever was broken, and go back to work. Looking back, I should have just called Bill Henderson and told him his barn was haunted or malfunctioning or whatever, but I didn't. The ladder was slick with rain. I climbed slowly, keeping my weight centered until I reached the edge of the roof. The scratching was louder up here, sharp and insistent. I pulled myself onto the shingles and crawled toward the peak, my boots slipping on the wet surface. When I got close enough to touch the weather vane, I reached out and grabbed the shaft. The metal was ice cold, and it stopped immediately, just froze in place under my hand like it had never been moving at all. I checked the bearing. It was rusted solid, completely seized. I tried to turn the vane manually and couldn't budge it even slightly. This thing hadn't moved in years, maybe decades. The rust had welded it in place. But directly beneath the vane, carved into the shingles, was a fresh groove, a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter, worn deep into the asphalt coating. The edges were sharp and clean, like something had been grinding against the roof with enormous pressure. I ran my hand along the groove. The shingle material was still warm to the touch. Here's the thing that made me stop breathing. The groove wasn't a single circle, it was 2 circles, overlapping slightly. One carved on top of the other, like the vane had completed one full rotation, stopped, and then started again in a slightly different position. I looked at the vane in my hand. It was pointing northwest. I turned around to check my bearings against the horizon. When I looked back, I noticed something I'd missed before. There were scratch marks on the metal rooster itself, fresh gouges in the oxidized surface like something had been gripping it. The rain had stopped. The whole farm was silent except for my breathing and the distant sound of cattle settling down for the night. I climbed down from that roof faster than I should have and didn't stop moving until I was back in my truck with the engine running and the heaters on full blast. I called Bill Henderson the next morning and told him I couldn't work the property anymore. Didn't give him a real reason, just said I'd found another job. He was annoyed, but he paid me what he owed, and that was it. I drove past the Henderson place one more time about a month later. Had to take that road to get to a parts supplier in Pullman. I slowed down when I passed the barn, just enough to see the roof. The weather vane was still there, still pointing northwest, still rusted solid. But there was a 3rd circle now. I could see it from the road, overlapping the first 2 by maybe 6 inches. I haven't gone back. Bill sold the property in August to some developer from Seattle who's planning to convert it into a wedding venue. I heard they're keeping the barn, restoring it. I wonder if they'll notice the marks on the roof, or if they'll think it's just weather damage, character, rustic charm. I wonder if they'll hear it. I'm going to be honest. I've never told anyone the full version of this. Not my girlfriend, not the Coast Guard when they asked their questions. Just that I had equipment trouble and needed a tow back. But I can't stop thinking about it, and maybe getting it out will help. I'm a software engineer, late 30s, pretty boring life in Seattle. Last October, I took a week off to kayak around the San Juan Islands, something I'd done a dozen times before. Solo trip. just me and the water. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I camp alone. I've been in rough weather. I know the Puget Sound. The first 2 days were perfect. Cold, clear mornings, glassy water in the channels between islands. I'd paddle 4 or 5 hours, pull up on some rocky beach, make camp. Standard stuff. The buoy showed up on day 3. It was small, maybe the size of a soccer ball, bright red with a white stripe. I noticed it because of the color, really vivid against the gray-green water. It was about 50 yards off my port side, just drifting. I remember thinking someone must have lost their crab pot. Happens all the time out there. I kept paddling. About 20 minutes later, I looked over and the buoy was still there. Same position, 50 yards, maybe a bit less. I figured we were just traveling in the same current, parallel paths. The sounds like that. Water moves in strange ways around the islands. By mid-afternoon, I'd crossed 2 channels and rounded the north end of Lopez Island. The buoy was still there, exact same distance. I stopped paddling and just sat there, letting the kayak drift. The buoy drifted too, maintaining that gap between us, 50 yards. I could have thrown a rock and maybe hit it if I had a good arm. I started paddling hard, really digging in, trying to put distance between us. Sprinted for maybe 10 minutes until my shoulders burned. When I looked back, there it was, 50 yards behind me now, trailing along. Here's the thing, I'm a rational person. I know about currents and wind patterns. I tried to logic it out. Maybe it was caught in the same current band I was in, some quirk of tidal flow. But I'd crossed into different water conditions 3 or 4 times by then. I'd gone through rip currents near the points where water speeds up. The buoy should have been swept away or fallen behind. I decided to ignore it, just keep to my route, set up camp on Shaw Island like I'd planned. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, there it was. Bright red, bobbing along, keeping pace. That night I beached on a rocky stretch on Shaw's eastern shore. Set up my tent, got a fire going. I couldn't see the buoy in the dark, but I kept looking out at the water. The moon was almost full and the sound was calm, just gentle waves on the rocks. I didn't sleep well. Morning of day 4, I packed up, launched the kayak, paddled about 30 yards out and scanned the water. The buoy was 50 yards offshore, same distance, like it had been waiting. I felt something shift in my chest, not quite fear yet, but something close to it, a wrongness. I changed my route, headed south instead of west like I'd planned. Didn't matter. By noon, the buoy was still with me. I tried everything. Paddled straight at it. It would drift backward, staying ahead of me at that exact distance. Tried cutting hard to the right, zigzagging, doubling back. It adjusted, not quickly, not with any obvious movement. But when I checked again, there it was, 50 yards. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just paddle over and grab it, see what it was? I tried. On the afternoon of day 4, I spent an hour trying to close the distance. I'd paddle straight at it, and the gap just wouldn't close. It was like trying to reach the horizon. The buoy would be there, vivid and clear, but I couldn't get any closer. By day 5, I'd stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie in my tent and think about that buoy out there in the dark, maintaining its position. I started having this thought I couldn't shake. What if I swam out to it? What if I got in the water and tried to reach it that way? The thought made me feel sick, but I couldn't stop having it. Day 6, I was crossing Rosario Strait, heading toward Deception Pass. The water was rougher there, 3-foot swells, wind picking up. I was about halfway across when I realized I hadn't checked for the buoy in over an hour. I'd been too focused on the waves. I stopped paddling and turned to look. It was there, 50 yards, bobbing in the swells, bright red, impossible to miss. And I couldn't do it anymore. I pulled my binoculars out of the dry bag. My hands were shaking. Had been shaking for 2 days, honestly, but I got the binoculars focused. The buoy was perfectly spherical, smooth plastic, that white stripe around the middle. Nothing unusual, no markings, just a standard fishing buoy. I watched it bob with the waves, up and down, the way buoys do. Then I noticed something. A wave rolled through bigger than the others, and the buoy dropped into the trough. It should have bobbed back up in a random direction, pushed by the water. But it didn't. It corrected, just slightly. A small movement to the left, like it was adjusting its position. I kept watching. Another wave. Another tiny correction. The movements were subtle, maybe just a few inches each time, but they were deliberate. The buoy wasn't drifting with the current. It was maintaining its position relative to me, actively, constantly. Something was under it. I dropped the binoculars. They hit the kayak's hull with a crack that I barely heard over the blood rushing in my ears. I couldn't get a full breath. My chest felt compressed. I grabbed my radio and called the Coast Guard. Told them I was having trouble with my rudder, needed assistance. They found me 2 hours later and towed me back to Anacortes. The whole time I kept looking back at the water. I never saw the buoy again after I made that call. The Coast Guard guy who helped me asked if I was feeling all right. Said I looked pretty shaken up for a rudder problem. I told him I was just tired. I sold my kayak 3 weeks later. Haven't been back to the Sound since. I keep thinking about those small corrections, the way it adjusted its position to stay exactly 50 yards away. Something wanted to follow me. Something wanted me to know it was there. I still look at water differently now. Lakes, rivers, even swimming pools. I find myself scanning for bright colors, for anything that seems to be holding position. My girlfriend thinks I'm developing some kind of phobia. Maybe I am. My name is Owen King, and for 6 months I worked as a night security guard at the old Grays Harbor Mill on the industrial edge of Aberdeen. The mill shut down in 2019, lumber market crash, union disputes, the usual story. The owners mothballed the whole operation instead of dismantling it. Cheaper to lock it up and wait for a buyer than to scrap 40 years of equipment. My job was simple. Make rounds every 2 hours, check the perimeter, make sure kids or copper thieves weren't breaking in. 12-hour shifts, 6 nights a week. I'm a pretty rational person for context. I needed the money and the work was easy. The mill is massive, 3 connected buildings covering maybe 4 acres of concrete floor. The main production hall is the size of an aircraft hangar, filled with conveyor systems, gang saws, and a primary blade that's probably 15 feet in diameter. Everything was powered down and locked in place with massive steel pins. Thick dust covered every surface. The air smelled like old machine oil and decades of sawdust that had worked its way into every crack. First 2 weeks were boring. I'd walk the facility with my flashlight, check the loading bays, sit in the small security office near the front gate and watch whatever I could stream on my phone. The building made normal sounds, metal contracting in the cold, wind moving through gaps in the roof panels. I got used to it. The sound started on my 15th night. I was in the office around 3 in the morning when I heard it. Distant, muffled, but unmistakable. The high mechanical whine of a saw blade spinning up. That specific sound rising in pitch as it accelerates, hitting that steady scream when it reaches full speed. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the production hall. The whole way there I kept telling myself it was something else. Wind through a gap, a bird trapped in the rafters, my imagination. But I knew that sound. I'd heard it during my first walkthrough when the supervisor played me a video of the mill in operation, showing me what to look out for. That was the main saw. The production hall was silent when I got there. I swept my light across the equipment. Everything was still, covered in dust. The main saw blade was locked in place with 3 thick steel pins, each one requiring a hydraulic system to retract. The blade itself was coated in rust along the teeth. I walked up to it and put my hand on the housing. Cold metal. No vibration, no heat. Nothing. I checked every piece of equipment in that building. All of it was cold and still. I convinced myself I had heard something from outside, maybe a truck on the highway, sound traveling weird through the empty building. I went back to the office. It happened again at 3 a.m. the next night, same sound, same duration. This time I was already in the production hall sitting on an old workbench waiting. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like it was embedded in the walls themselves. I could hear other sounds underneath it. The clank and rattle of the chain conveyors, the hydraulic hiss of the log carriage, the entire mill running through a full production cycle, distant and muffled, like I was hearing it through thick glass. I ran to the main saw. The blade was motionless. I pressed my ear against the housing, holding my breath. Nothing, but the sounds continued around me, echoing through the vast space. Then they stopped. Complete silence. So sudden it felt like pressure in my ears. I don't know how else to explain it, but that's when I noticed the smell. Fresh cut wood. Sharp and clean. Totally different from the stale sawdust smell that permeated everything. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then faded. The next morning I found the shavings. They were directly beneath the main saw blade, scattered across maybe a 3-foot circle of concrete floor. Thin, curled wood shavings, the kind that come off a blade cutting through green lumber. They were pale and clean, nothing like the ancient gray sawdust coating everything else. I picked one up. It was slightly damp, flexible, fresh. I swept them up and threw them in the dumpster outside. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't know what I'd say. It happened every night after that, always at 3 a.m., always the same sequence of sounds, saw spinning up, conveyors running, hydraulics hissing, lasting anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And every morning I'd find fresh shavings under that blade. I started taking pictures of the saw before I left each shift, checking them against what I found the next night. The rust pattern never changed. The dust on the housing was never disturbed. The steel pins were always in place, covered in their own layer of undisturbed grime, but the shavings kept appearing. By the 3rd week, I was barely sleeping during the day. I'd lie in bed and stare at my phone, looking at the pictures, trying to find any detail I'd missed. I thought about quitting, but I needed the job. The economy in Aberdeen isn't great. I told myself I could handle some weird sounds and inexplicable wood shavings. Then I found the log. I was making my 2 a.m. round an hour before the sounds usually started. My flashlight caught something that wasn't there before. A section of old-growth Douglas fir, maybe 8 feet long and 3 feet in diameter, lying on the floor beside the main saw's feed platform. The wood was dark with age, but clean. No dust, no cobwebs. I got close enough to touch it. The bark was intact, still attached. I could smell the sap. I put my hand on it and felt cold moisture against my palm. Here's the thing, there was no way to get a log that size into the building. The loading bay doors were chained shut from the inside. I'd checked them an hour earlier. The chains hadn't been touched, and no one could have moved something that heavy, without equipment, without leaving marks on the dusty floor. But there it was. I walked away, went back to the office, sat there with my hand shaking so badly I couldn't hold my coffee cup. When 3 a.m. came, I didn't move. I sat in that office with the door closed and listened. The sounds were louder that night, close. The saw wasn't just running, it was cutting. I could hear the blade biting into wood, that specific grinding vibration when it hits dense grain. The conveyors were moving something heavy. The whole building seemed to rattle with mechanical rhythm. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just leave? Because I'd convinced myself I was losing it. That stress or lack of sleep or something had me hallucinating. If I ran out of there in the middle of the night, I'd have to explain why. I'd sound insane. I needed the job. I told myself to wait it out. The sounds stopped at 3:17 a.m. I waited another 20 minutes before I went back into the production hall. The log was gone. In its place, stacked neatly on the outfeed table, were fresh-cut boards. 6 of them, each about 8 feet long, 2 inches thick. The cut edges were clean and smooth. No saw marks, no burning. Perfect cuts. I touched one. The wood was warm. That's when I noticed the blade. The main saw blade was moving. Not spinning, just rotating slowly, maybe one full turn every 30 seconds. No sound. No power. The steel pins were still in place, still covered in dust. The blade was moving through them like they weren't there. I couldn't move. I stood there watching that massive blade rotate silently in the dark, and for the first time I understood that I wasn't dealing with sounds or shavings or logs I could rationalize away. Something was operating that mill, using it every night at 3 a.m. I quit the next day, told the supervisor I had a family emergency. He didn't ask questions. I don't know who they got to replace me or if they're still working there. I drive past the mill sometimes, always during the day. The building sits there like it always has, windows dark, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot, completely abandoned. But every time I pass it, I think about 3 a.m. I think about that blade turning, and I wonder what happens to the boards, where they go when the sun comes up. I'm a long-haul trucker, have been for 15 years. I mention that because the road doesn't usually get to me. I've seen plenty of weird stuff out there at 3 in the morning, things your brain makes up when you've been driving too long. This wasn't that. It was a Thursday night in early November, maybe 2 years ago. I was running my regular Spokane to Seattle route, and the rain had been coming down hard since I crossed into the Cascades. Not the usual Pacific Northwest drizzle. This was the kind of rain that turns your windshield into a waterfall, even with the wipers on full blast. Visibility was maybe 30 feet if I was lucky. I was about 40 minutes past Snoqualmie Pass, somewhere in that long stretch where there's nothing but trees and darkness on both sides of Interstate 90. No street lights out there, just the white lines and reflectors to keep you on the road. The clock on my dash read 1:47 in the morning. That's when I saw the hazard lights. They were faint at first through the rain, just these twin orange pulses off to the right shoulder. As I got closer, I could make out the shape. An old sedan, maybe from the late 90s, pulled completely off the road. Dark color, hard to tell in the rain. Could have been dark blue or black. Now look, I've driven past plenty of abandoned cars. Most times you keep going, call it in to highway patrol, let them deal with it. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the hazards still blinking, like someone had just left it there. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another vehicle in either direction for at least 20 minutes. I pulled over about 50 feet ahead of it, put on my own flashers, left the engine running. I grabbed my maglite from the door pocket and climbed down from the cab. The rain hit me immediately, cold and hard enough to sting. I had to shield my eyes with one hand while I walked back toward the sedan. My boot splashed through water running along the shoulder. The sound of the rain was so loud it almost felt like static in my ears. The car was a Honda Accord, early 2000s, covered in grime and road spray. The driver's side door was facing the road. I swept my flashlight beam across it. No plates, front or back, nothing, just the empty brackets. I knocked on the driver's window, called out. No response. The glass was fogged on the inside, but I could see enough to know the car was empty. No one in the front seats, no one in the back. Here's the thing. The keys were still in the ignition. I could see them hanging there, and the hazard button was pushed in. That meant someone had been there recently enough to leave the hazards on, but when I tried the door, it was locked. I stepped back, swept my light around the area. Nothing but trees and rain and darkness. No footprints in the mud, no sign of where someone might have walked off to. The shoulder dropped off into a steep embankment on the right side covered in blackberry bushes and ferns. No way someone went down there in this weather. I stood there getting soaked, trying to decide what to do. That's when I noticed I wasn't hearing the rain anymore. I could still feel it hitting my jacket, still see it falling through my flashlight beam. But the sound had changed. Muffled somehow, like someone had put a blanket over the world. That's the best way I can describe it. I turned to head back to my truck, and that's when I saw the shadow on the side of my cab. It was maybe 15 feet away, standing between me and my truck. And I need you to understand, there was no light source. None. My truck's headlights were pointing forward. There were no street lights, no other vehicles, nothing that could cast a shadow. But there it was, perfectly defined against the wet metal of my cab. The silhouette of a person, roughly my height, normal proportions, just standing there, completely still. I froze. My first thought was that someone had been crouched near my truck and I hadn't seen them. I swung my flashlight toward where the shadow's source should be, where the actual person should be standing, and there was nothing. Empty road, empty shoulder, just rain falling through empty air. But the shadow didn't disappear when my light swept across it. It stayed exactly where it was, perfectly solid and black against my truck. I took a step to my left. The shadow moved the same direction, same speed, staying exactly parallel to me. My hand started shaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I moved right. The shadow moved right. It was mirroring me, perfectly synchronized. But there was nobody there. The space where a person should be was just rain and darkness. I don't know how long I stood there. Could have been 10 seconds. Could have been a minute. Time felt broken. I was trying to rationalize it. Some trick of the rain, reflection from my truck's lights, something. But my truck's headlights were pointed forward, and this shadow was on the side of my cab facing me. Then the shadow raised its arm. I hadn't moved. I was still holding my flashlight down at my side, but the shadow's right arm lifted slowly until it was extended toward me, fingers spread. I could see the individual fingers, 5 of them, perfectly detailed. That's when I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My body just moved. I bolted for my truck, fumbling for the door handle with numb fingers. I yanked it open and hauled myself up into the cab, slammed the door behind me, hit the lock, put the truck in gear and accelerated so hard the wheels spun before catching. I didn't look in my mirrors. I just drove. About 10 miles down the road, I pulled into a rest area that had lights, actual lights. I sat there in the parking lot with the engine running for almost an hour before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to hold my phone. I called Highway Patrol and told them about the abandoned Honda, gave them the approximate mile marker, said I thought someone might need help. Didn't mention the shadow. What would I even say? They called me back about 45 minutes later, said they sent a unit out to check. There was no car there, no Honda, no vehicle of any kind, no evidence anything had been pulled over at that location. I know what I saw. I know I knocked on that window. I know I saw those keys in the ignition. And I know that Shadow was exactly the right height and build to be whoever was driving that car, standing right next to me in the rain, close enough to touch. I still run the Spokane to Seattle route, but I don't stop for anything on that stretch of road anymore, and I try to time it so I'm through the pass before midnight. Last month I saw hazard lights in almost the exact same spot. I kept driving, didn't even slow down.